You know those moments in therapy? You're doing everything right, hitting all the theoretical points, making these really sharp interpretations. But something feels off. Like a subtle coldness enters the room, a disconnect. What if the very way you're thinking, the framework you're applying, is somehow, subtly, missing the deepest thing your patient is struggling with? Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we are going deep into a paper that tackles this exact feeling, and it's a landmark. Cohut's The Two Analyses of Mr. Z. And this isn't just, a case study. It's amazing because you get to see a master clinician basically rethink an entire treatment, his own evolution, laid bare. So our plan today is to unpack this paper together, almost like we're in a clinical seminar, side by side, hitting pause and asking, okay, wait, what just happened there? We'll try using the Feynman technique, explaining these complex ideas simply, like you would to a smart friend who isn't a therapist, just to make sure we really get it. Because the goal isn't just understanding what Cohut did, but feeling the weight of those choices, the complexity, and maybe seeing echoes in your own work.
Absolutely. It really gets to the heart of that tension, doesn't it? Between nailing the interpretation and truly attuning to the patient's actual lived experience, between finding meaning and just being present. And it's incredible how Cohut, shifting his whole perspective, opened up something truly transformative for Mr. Z. It's less about just the facts of the case and more about how it unfolded and what that tells us about our own way of being in the room.
Okay, so let's start at the beginning. Let's meet Mr. Z as Cohut first saw him. He's described as handsome, intelligent, a graduate student, mid-20s. Living with his widowed mom seems comfortable enough, but his presenting problems were vague. Some physical stuff like heart palpitations, sweaty palms, stomach issues, minor things really, but hiding underneath all that, much deeper, more troubling stuff.
Yeah, exactly. And the hardest part for Mr. Z to talk about because of intense shame were these frequent, really intensely masochistic masturbation fantasies. He'd imagined being, completely submissive to a powerful, dominating woman, themes sometimes drawn from Uncle Tom's Cabin, incredibly degrading stuff, fantasies of being treated like cattle, like an object, even being forced to ingest waste. Really disturbing material.
So this is the first analysis. It's intensive, like 4 years, 5 times a week. How did Cohut initially understand all this? What was his classical psychoanalytic take?
Right. So back then, his main lens was what he termed a regressive mother transference. Now, transference, is projecting old relationship patterns onto the therapist. So regressive mother transference meant Cohut saw Mr. Z's grandiosity, his demands, as being stuck in a very early infantile stage with his mother. Before the whole Oedipus complex thing, he saw Mr. Z's anger when Cohut interpreted things as, basically, narcissistic resistance, something to be pointed out, analyzed, confronted.
And did that focus change over those 4 years, even staying within that classical model?
It did, yeah. Later on, the focus shifted more towards the classic Oedipus complex. So thinking about it in terms of, the boy's desire for the mother, rivalry with the father. Cohut started seeing Mr. Z's issues as stemming from castration anxiety, the unconscious fear of the powerful father figure, things like his childhood masturbation, his fantasies of a phallic woman, a woman with imagined male parts, and his memories of witnessing his parents having sex, which he saw as a fight. It all seemed to fit that Oedipal picture, and the masochism. That was explained as him sexualizing his guilt. Guilt over wanting mom, guilt over rivalry with dad. The phallic woman fantasy was seen as a way to defend against that castration fear.
And from Cohut's viewpoint then, this first analysis, it felt like a success, didn't it? Mr. Z seemed to get better.
Oh, absolutely. On the surface, things looked pretty good. The masochistic stuff. Almost non-existent, Cohut wrote. Mr. Z moved out, started dating, thought about marriage, got more assertive professionally. Cohut really believed this was structural change, like a fundamental shift in his personality. He thought he had helped Mr. Z work through the core conflicts. Looked like a win.
But there's that little clue. Something Mr. Z said that Cohut kind of brushed off at the time, but later realized was huge.
Exactly. Mr. Z casually mentioned that a positive shift he felt wasn't because of Cohut's deep interpretations about narcissism or Oedipus complexes. It was because of this one, seemingly minor phrase Cohut used. Of course, it hurts when one is not given what one assumes to be one's due. Cohut initially just saw this as resistance, maybe Mr. Z trying to minimize the analysis or save face. He had no idea then how incredibly important that simple, empathic-sounding phrase actually was.
Okay, so analysis ends. 5.5 years go by. And then Mr. Z gets back in touch. Things aren't so good again. The success story, it wasn't holding up. That was been quite a moment for Cohut himself, realizing that.
You have to imagine it was, yeah. Really humbling. Despite moving out, dating, all that surface stuff, Mr. Z said his relationships felt emotionally shallow. His sex life, no real satisfaction. Work felt like a grind, a chore. And crucially, those masochistic fantasies, they hadn't really gone away. He was actually using them during sex, sort of as an antidote to premature ejaculation, he said, and to experience the sexual act more keenly. He was feeling pulled back to the old solitary patterns, too. So yeah, the core problems. Still very much there. Untouched, really.
And this leads to the thing that really blew the case open for Cohut, the piece of information that changed everything. It was about Mr. Z's mother, right?
Yeah.
That was it. The catalyst. Mr. Z revealed his mother had developed circumscribed paranoid delusions, specific, fixed paranoid beliefs. But here's the absolutely stunning part. Mr. Z's reaction wasn't worry or sadness. It was this quietly experienced, intense inner joy, a sense of utter relief. Why? Because now there might be witnesses to how distorted her view of reality actually was. This reaction was the key that unlocked a whole new way of understanding for Cohut.
Because Cohut himself was changing his thinking around this time, wasn't he? He was in the middle of developing self-psychology, writing analysis of the self.
Exactly. He wasn't just applying an existing theory anymore, he was forging a new one.
Yeah.
This new frame of reference, as he called it, literally allowed him to see things differently. He could perceive meanings or the significance of meanings that he just hadn't consciously grasped before. It wasn't just a minor tweak. It was a fundamental shift in how he listened and what he listened for.
And that new way of seeing led to a completely different way of being with Mr. Z in the second analysis. The first one, rage, defensive narcissism, confronted. What about now?
Totally different stance. In the second round, Cohut approached the material with respectful seriousness. He saw Mr. Z's demanding behavior not as resistance to fight, but as an analytically valuable replica of a childhood condition. He basically said he relinquished the health and maturity morality that had guided him before. Meaning, he stopped subtly pressuring Mr. Z to act healthy according to Cohut's classical ideas. And this shift, it was huge. It rid the analysis of a burdensome iatrogenic artifact.
Iatrogenic meaning caused by the treatment itself.
Exactly. He realized Mr. Z's unproductive rage wasn't just resistance, it was partly a reaction to Cohut's earlier confrontational, non-empathic stance. So now the focus wasn't on fixing defenses, it was on reconstructing the early stages of his experiences, especially his entanglement with his mother's pathology. Mr. Z wasn't seen as fighting change anymore, but as desperately struggling to disentangle his fragile self from this noxious self-object.
Noxious self-object. Okay, that's a core Cohut idea. Break that down for us, especially regarding the mother.
Right, so a self-object isn't quite a person in the full sense, but someone who performs crucial psychological functions for a developing child, like mirroring their feelings, being someone to idealize, providing a sense of twinship. A noxious self-object is someone who performs these functions in a deeply harmful, distorted way. Cohut now understood the mother didn't just love Mr. Z. Her emotional gifts came with an absolute condition, total domination by her. She was described as intensely and pathologically jealous, needing him constantly to shore up her own fragile self. He had to be her permanent self-object. Her love wasn't nurturing, it was consuming. It demanded the erasure of his separateness. It wasn't just about drives or libido. It was about his very existence as an independent self being conditional.
So it wasn't about, say, spoiling him like the old view might suggest. It was about this deep pathological neediness on her part that basically smothered his self-development.
Precisely. Take her obsessive focus on his bodily functions. First his feces until he was 6, then later his skin, his blackheads. She had this weekly ritual of painfully extracting them and showing them to him, like a fecal mass in miniature. Cohut now saw this not as some weird form of maternal care, but as her relentless, unmodifiable need to retain her son as a permanent self-object. It wasn't making Mr. Z feel special, it made him feel hopeless and depressed, because her focus wasn't really on him as a person, but on him as an extension of herself, something to control and manage to keep her own sense of self intact. This was the psychotic core. She hid this emptiness she filled by controlling him.
And this leads to that incredible replica idea. The notion that Cohut's own way of working, his theory, could inadvertently repeat the mother's dynamic. That's a heavy thought for any therapist.
It really is. It's profoundly challenging. Cohut realized that his firm, classical theoretical convictions in that first analysis had, for Mr. Z, become like the mother's hidden psychosis. Mr. Z, being attuned to the powerful figure's needs, had simply complied with Cohut's expectations, giving him the Oedipal material Cohut was looking for, just like he'd always complied with his mother's subtle and not-so-subtle demands. The success of the first analysis, it was compliance, not cure. It's a stark reminder that our theories, our certainty, if we're not careful, can actually re-traumatize rather than heal.
Wow. He was basically performing analysis for Kohut, suppressing his real, deeper self needs. And this new understanding, it changed how Kohut saw Mr. Z's earlier traumas too, right? The masturbation, the primal scene.
Completely reframed them. The masturbation wasn't about forbidden pleasure anymore, but the joyless pleasure of a defeated self. A desperate attempt to obtain the reassurance of being alive, of existing when genuine connection was absent. The primal scene memory. Not just Oedipal terror, but an unempathically overstimulating experience where he felt demanded to be absorbed by his mother's needs, submitting through a masochistically sexualized relinquishment of his independence. It shifts the focus from seeing symptoms as purely pathological drives needing taming to understanding them as often distorted attempts at survival, at finding some way to feel real or alive in an invalidating environment. Even that deeply shameful secret he later revealed, anal masturbation involving feces, was understood with empathy, not disgust, as feeble attempts to provide for himself a feeling of aliveness. The impulse wasn't the problem. The lack of empathic connection that led to such desperate measures was.
This tension between interpretation and attunement is just so palpable here. Let's try to make this really concrete for you listening. Imagine you, or let's say a fictional therapist we know, Lior Hamlick. Imagine Lior in a similar spot. So Lior's working with a child, maybe one with some repetitive self-soothing habits. And Lior, he's sharp, he makes this really insightful interpretation based on his training. Maybe he sees it as a defense or related to a specific drive. He feels pretty good about it, analytically sound. But then he notices something subtle. The kid withdraws just a tiny bit. The energy in the room feels colder, a quiet shutdown. And Lior starts wondering, like Kohout did with Mr. Z, wait, was my brilliant interpretation actually ahead of where the child is right now? Did I meet the meaning but miss the person? Did it maybe unintentionally ask for a kind of compliance the child wasn't ready for?
That Lior vignette, it captures it perfectly. That's the heart of Kohout's struggle in the first analysis. His interpretations, while maybe correct within his old framework, landed ahead of Mr. Z's actual felt experience.
Yeah.
They created that distance that chill Lior felt. And the big shift for Kohout was realizing, okay, understanding why isn't always enough. The how of the interaction, that empathic resonance, that's where the real therapeutic action often is, which brings up that critical question for all of us, right? How do we offer insight? How do we help make sense of things without inadvertently imposing our reality, our theory onto the patient before they're ready? How do we give meaning without demanding compliance?
So as Mr. Z started to kind of pull away from that deep enmeshment with his mother in the second analysis, the focus shifted again, didn't it, towards his father?
Yes, dramatically. As the depression lifted somewhat, Mr. Z started expressing these active yearnings, really intense demands, and a growing sense of vitality, buoyancy, and hopefulness, all directed towards his father, or the idea of a father. Remember his intense curiosity about Kohout from the first analysis, initially seen as infantile voyeurism. Now, Kohout re-understood it as a deep need for a strong father. Mr. Z needed to know, was Kohout solid? Or was he weak, subdued, like he experienced his own father to be? Just reframing that curiosity, understanding the need behind it, led to a significant decrease in Mr. Z's depression and hopelessness. It validated a core yearning.
And then actually recalling positive things about his father became a real turning point.
A massive one. Kohout called it a crucial moment. Mr. Z started talking about his father's good qualities with, Kohout says, a glow of happiness. He remembered a skiing trip when he was 9 and suddenly saw his father not just as weak or absent, but as an independent man who had a life independent from the life of the mother. This memory, this image of his father's separateness and competence, Kohout believed, was the deepest layer of the repressed, positive self-object experience. It was a hidden resource, a blueprint for his own potential independence.
In that famous dream from the first analysis, Mr. Z, struggling to shut the door on his father who was bringing gifts that had got a whole new meaning to,
completely flipped. No longer Oedipal rivalry or fear of castration. Now, Kohout saw it as representing the mental state of a boy who had been all too long without a father. A boy starved for psychological subsist to build his own masculine self. The gifts weren't threatening. They were the overwhelming psychological nourishment he craved but felt unprepared to receive. Similarly, that preteen homosexual relationship with a camp counselor, reevaluated, not a regression back to a phallic mother figure, but a desperate search for a strong fatherly man, an admired older brother, an attempt to find a male self-object to connect with, to borrow strength from.
This all connects to another really key Kohout concept that emerged from this case, the vertical split. Can you walk us through that?
Yeah, the vertical split is essential for understanding Mr. Z. It's not like traditional repression where things are buried deep down. That's a horizontal split. With a vertical split, imagine two parts of the personality existing side by side, often unaware of each other, separated by a kind of wall. So one part of Mr. Z remained deeply enmeshed with the mother, compliant, grandiose on the surface, but another part, quieter but vital, separated by this wall of disavowal, held on to idealizations that maintained a bond to his father, memories of his father's strength, his potential. The wall kept these parts disconnected. The second analysis aimed to dissolve that wall, to integrate these split-off parts, allowing Mr. Z to access that healthier, father-connected part of himself and build a more cohesive identity.
But moving towards that integration, towards becoming independent, wasn't smooth sailing. It brought up a different kind of terror.
Oh, absolutely. As he started to shift towards independence, Mr. Z experienced recurrent attacks of severe anxiety. Even some terrifying quasi-psychotic experiences where he felt like he was falling apart, disintegrating. Kohout called this disintegration anxiety. It was the profound fear of letting go of the old, familiar, albeit pathological self that was fused with the mother self object. Letting go of that meant stepping into the unknown territory of an independent nuclear self he'd never really inhabited before. Terrifying. He had a dream of his mother turning her back, which filled him with dread. Kohout saw this as representing the horror of finally seeing her distorted personality, clearly, without the old defenses, recognizing that trial fully felt like it could shatter the very structure of the self he knew.
So after this incredibly intense and obviously very different second analysis, what was the final outcome? Did it stick? Was it truly different this time?
Yes. According to Kohout, the outcome was profoundly different. The second analysis facilitated transmuting internalizations. That's Kohout's term for finally building the missing internal psychological structures. Like, he internalized the empathic connection with Kohout, which allowed him to develop the self-soothing and self-esteem functions he couldn't get from his parents. The biggest achievement, breaking the deep merger ties with his mother. He finally became his own person, psychologically separate.
And what did that look like in his actual life? How did this internal shift show up?
Well, his talents, his ambitions, which might have initially been connected to pleasing his mother, he now experienced them as truly his own. He pursued them joyfully as the activities of an independent self, not out of that old masochistic compliance. He also developed real empathy, a tolerant attitude toward the shortcomings of his parents. He could even feel compassion for his mother's issues, recognizing her contributions like a core of vitality, but from a place of separateness and maleness. He wasn't trapped by her anymore.
And the long-term picture.
Kohout reports that years later, Mr. Z married someone described as well-balanced, warm-hearted, socially outgoing, who seemed to embody his father's best features embedded in a matrix of femininity. Nice phrase. And professionally, Mr. Z became outstanding in his field, an inspiring teacher. This wasn't just symptom relief like the first time. This was genuine, deep structural change. A fundamentally different person emerged.
So reflecting on this whole journey through Mr. Z's two analyses, what's the big takeaway here for you listening, especially if you're grappling with these things in your own clinical work? We've traced how Kohout, by fundamentally shifting his perspective, moving from drive theory to self-psychology, could suddenly hear and see things that were invisible before. It enabled this incredibly deep, lasting transformation. It really highlights that move from focusing solely on intellectual interpretation, on figuring out the meaning, towards emphasizing empathic attunement, towards understanding the experience, from correcting defenses to supporting the birth of a cohesive self. So here's a little prompt, a gentle challenge for you to take away. Try summarizing, just in your own words, Kohout's shift between that first and second analysis. What really changed in how he approached Mr. Z? What stayed the same in terms of what Mr. Z brought, but gained a completely new significance? And maybe most importantly, how might really paying attention to that difference interpretation versus attunement, meaning versus presence, guide you in your very next session? What might you listen for differently?